course, more recently, Bruno Boschdel and Jody Bean, who are here tonight. And yeah, I mean, I think what all of these texts kind of have in common is that they just reanalyze and assess communism as an ideological and political apparatus in the 21st century after the Cold War, and in the case of Jody's book, after Occupy as well. Actually, everybody on the panel tonight had some involvement in Occupy, so that's going to be a central theme of the discussion tonight, I think. Oh, and one last note. The series has kind of come full circle because we started with Badiou, and we're actually publishing a new book by Badiou next month called Philosophy for Militants, which was translated by Bruno. So let's see. So our panel tonight, of course, is Bruno Boschdel, who's a professor of Romance Studies at Cornell, the author of Badiou and Politics, Marx and Freud in Latin America, and of course the actuality of communism. Jody Bean teaches political and media theory in Geneva, upstate. She drove here tonight. I was afraid that she wouldn't make it, but here she is. And of course is the author of The Communist Horizon. And Astra Taylor will be moderating the discussion. I'm sure you all know that she is a filmmaker, the director of Zizek and Examine Life, and is also the co-editor of our Occupy book. So please join me in welcoming our guests.
Everyone, thanks for coming. It's an honor to be here. I have to say, this isn't quite pocket-sized. I had to read these books really fast. Maybe the Purse Communism series is quite big in my pocket. And also, I'm not sure how knowledgeable I am since I was going to call Bruno Bastils, since I'm from Georgia. And, sorry, now I will pronounce it. So both these books claim to owe a debt to this conference that happened in 2009 on the idea of communism, which many believed heralded a new academic sort of institutional interest in the idea of communism, idea with a capital I. And that conference happened against the backdrop of a global economic crisis, of course. Suddenly we started to hear about banks that were too big to fail. And the real message of that, of course, is that failure was a possibility, that maybe capitalism could fail. And so the logic of there is no alternative was called into question. So the question is, of course, what is the alternative? And these two thinkers said the alternative is communism. But since 2009, of course, since that academic conference, the world has erupted in protest. And yet most of the movements around the globe are calling for democracy, not communism. That's one unifying rallying cry. And Jody in particular is very critical of that cry. So the question is, could the alternative these movements seek, and that we as a people need, actually be communism? Could communism, as Bruno's title insists, have an actuality? So I want to just begin to give you a flavor of these books. One interesting aspect of them is the way that even though Bruno's book came out first, Jody's is already alive in the book in this really interesting way. So under a section called The Communist Horizon, Bruno writes, to overcome its melancholic attachment to marginality and failure, could not the left once again take up the task of the radical critique of the status quo in the name of a communist alternative, including an alternative to the melancholy left? To what extent can we say that communism today is an actuality and not a specter, a real movement and not just a ghostly spirit from the dead past, or one whose only forward-looking move is to postulate the need for a speculative philosophical idea, whether Kantian or Platonic? Furthermore, can communism offer a way out of the moralization of politics that follows from the endless self-flagellations of the left? Or is the hopeful invocation of the communist hypothesis, especially when it is no longer tied to any real movement to abolish the current state of affairs, part and parcel of the same old self-sacrificing genealogy of morals? We're going to answer all those questions in an hour and 15 minutes. So, now actually the first question we're going to answer is, where did you get the title of your book? And I kind of just answered it. Jody.
Okay. Can you hear me? Is the mic okay? Right? Everyone can hear? So I got the Communist Horizon title from Bruno. The conference, and I guess it was now about 2.5 years ago in Rotterdam, Bruno was giving a fantastic paper where he invoked the vice president of Bolivia, Alvaro Garcia Linera, and a speech from Garcia Linera where Garcia Linera says something about keeping your expecting and desiring eyes set on the communist horizon. And I was like totally excited. I thought this was the most kind of wonderful thing that I could heard, particularly in an academic setting ever. And I really liked it because it had a sense of political possibility, a political mission. It opened things up in a way that the last 20 years of sort of micro-politics and tiny little specific detailed analysis of the everyday had closed down. So I got very excited about this title and, or about this idea of the communist horizon. Actually, when I asked Bruno about it, at that time you weren't so totally like thrilled with it. So maybe you can say more about where you get it, and then Garcia Linera and what that meant.
Well, it's so Jody actually. I mean, it is true that I included Jody's book through an essay that was available online. Because she actually convinced me that there was something about the horizon as a notion that was very interesting. So that's why I quoted, knowing that then it was coming to come out also with Verso as a book, that she said, no, I really like this notion of the horizon in the sense that it's kind of unavoidable. It's not the receding thing that you can never reach, but rather it's always there. And also Garcia Linera was saying, in a very strange passage, because he's actually sort of recollecting why he moved from a radical leftist armed struggle kind of ideology to a pro-state electoral politics. And how to justify that shift, he talks suddenly in the present tense, but talking about the past. And he says the horizon was communist. Or the horizon is communist. So when we come into the government, the horizon is communist. And it just says it sort of like off the cuff, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. And it was Jody who sort of gave a riff on there in Holland on why it's so important to talk about horizon. So that's when you started building on the very question of keeping the notion of not just communism, but making it a horizon as kind of something that's always already there. And what I think what I want to ask you is, you came to this, I mean, more so than through the London conference in 2009, from your own work in part on Zizek. And so I wanted to ask you how different it is to come to this as a way of elaborating your own take on Zizek's work, and what the difference is, for example, in looking at it from a more Zizekian point of view versus, Badiou.
Zizek has a book, I think that, of course it came out with Verso, and I believe the title is Revolution at the Gates. It's a collection of short pieces from Lenin. And the afterword is called Lenin's Choice, and that could have been its own book. It's like 200 pages or something like this. And in that text, Zizek he describes the analyst, the leader, and the party as three similar kind of analogous positions, and they're all positions to which one has a relation of transference or a transferential relation. And what's important about all of them is even though the relation of transference to them is one where the subject's like, analyst, leader, party, tell us what to do. The analyst, the leader, and the party actually don't know at all. And that's one of the things that I found completely, I was just totally taken by in this account of the party as just a form like these other forms, and it's a form that's not, and so that's what Zizek does, right? He's got this form, and it's a form that establishes a relation of transference based on non-knowledge, right? And there's a kind of double non-knowledge, and this is where Zizek is not, he doesn't totally explore this, he mentions it a little, but I kind of jump on this and sort of beat it to death. And what he talks about is like, the people don't know, but the party doesn't know either. And that struck me as a terrific way of thinking about what a communist party needs to be. That it can't be a party that that anyone joins or agrees with or has solidarity with others in because it knows everything, because we all know it doesn't. But we could be members of a party knowing that we all have a kind of solidarity rooted in we don't know, but we still have a fidelity to, maybe a fidelity to the people or a fidelity to an event. And then, so this is where I actually want to turn it back to Bruno, because Bruno has a terrific way of thinking about the party. How do you put it? It's, oh yeah, in The Actuality of Communism, Bruno uses the expression, he describes the party as a flexible organization of a fidelity to events in the midst of unforeseen circumstances. A flexible organization of fidelity to events in the midst of unforeseen circumstances. And I like this very much. I actually think it has a lot of affinities with Lukács's account of the party in Lenin, the unicity of his thought. Which I talk about it in The Communist Horizon. Most people don't think of Lukács as sort of Mr. Flexible, but he actually has. He has this sort of great account of Lenin that's totally appreciative of responsiveness, non-knowledge, a kind of how you have to be disciplined but also flexible, right? And so anyway, I want to turn this back and ask Bruno, how does his account of the party, if maybe he could fill out more of this flexible organization of fidelity to events in the midst of unforeseen circumstances, and maybe connect that with Badiou, because my sense of, at least the more recent Badiou, is he's not a fan of the party, though he likes something sort of called political organization.
But I think we're in a sense agreeing on that, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the points in which I think Badiou, at least in the recent writings, including in the Communist Hypothesis, has sort of steered clear of any notion of, he says we need organization but without a party. So we need politics without a party. But everything that he says about organization today is actually the same thing that he was saying in the 70s and 80s when he was still calling it a party. Or even, he would use this sort of Maoist term, a party of a new type. And so, including in the rebirth of history, on the logic of riots and the Arab Spring and he has the same sort of comment. Right? There is a division between riots, and it's a very traditional point of view that still it's no longer talking about spontaneity and organization, but it ultimately comes down to the same scheme, that there are certain short-lived riots that are, he calls them anarchistic, and they need to gain duration in time, and they need to spread out in space, and then they can become potentially historical or pre-political movements, which is not enough yet, and they will only truly become political if they gain some form of organization. So in the last writings of the last decade, Badiou always insisted and ends with this note of sort of belief in organization. But it can be a party, and we certainly want to stay at a far distance from the state. And one of the reasons why I am sympathizing with Zizek, and I think we're all with Jody on the same page there, is to sort of question this rejection of the notion of both party and state. With the same scheme, so we need to move from riots to movement to organization, from sheer anarchist uprisings to some kind of lasting, it's always about duration or something that gains consistency or coherence over time, and also has a way of expanding its location, creating a space of its own that's more than just occupying a specific place right next to the centers of finance capitalism, or following the G7 international meetings, which for Badiou was not very effective either. But the same question about organization in the 1970s was called, we need a party of a new type. And if you look at Badiou's own organization, at one point it was called a party, and afterwards it was called political organization, period. But it's exactly the same structure. So I'm interested in what goes on, what happens when there's a certain historical balance sheet that has been taken into account, but that I think has not been fully digested because we have shifted the terms rather than the state. So I'm interested in the way in which Zizek, and Jody agrees with this throughout the book, insists on the question of a party as a need for a need for a political organization. That doesn't mean obviously electoral party. It also doesn't mean party with party affiliations and memberships. But it means to put the question of organization on the table. And I think this is for me a key issue. Now I want to sort of drive this a little bit of a wedge between Zizek and what Jody is doing in the book, because you also take a lot of critical distance from Zizek. And already in the talk that you gave in Holland, which was I think a version of the chapter on desire, you have this notion that desire is actually more radical than drive, which is very unorthodox for Zizekians, and I'm not sure how many Zizekians there are in the room, right? But for Zizek, there's always sort of a need to move from desire to drive, and to the last Lacan, and to the last version sort of the real question about a politics of the real, which is allied with a politics of the drive. So why do you insist on talking about desire without seeing it as a step back from the more radical, what seems to be the radicalism of the question of drive?
Can we maybe take a little step back in
Yeah.
a sense? Because you are jumping into the party when a lot of your book is building up to that as kind of the conclusion. A lot of what both you're doing is analyzing where political philosophy is and why they have avoided this issue of party and state. And I think before we get into desire and drive, Jody kind of did an analysis of left attachment to failure and leftist melancholia. And I think there's something, for me, one way I was reading both of your books, because over the last year I've been very involved in Occupy Wall Street and now Strike Debt, is actually thinking about the relationship between these political philosophers and activists and how they resort to sort of, or engage in a sort of similar set of coping mechanisms when it comes to the failure of communism. For example, an obsession with purity. You talk about speculative leftism and this desire for, speculative leftism is a symptom of the maddening desire for purity, you say. Anti-foundationalism, the idea of the activist rupture. Activists often hope, one protest will sort of change everything. And maybe there's a way of grounding this discussion of desire and drive, and what does that look like when people actually engage in it? What does it feel like? How does it relate to the fact that both academics and activists are pretty comfortable with failure and not as comfortable with success?
So I'll answer thinking about desire and drive, and then Bruno, I'm sure will use his terms, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so, and I actually think this actually will answer both sides. So, first, just to give a little definitions of how these terms work within the Lacanian edifice. Okay. So, in the sort of the world of Lacan, you have desire, which is a desire, which is something that you can never reach, right? It's based on a lack or a gap, and you reach for it and you can never get it. And that makes sense in a way, because if you think, if you got it, then okay, well, you don't want that anymore, right? So desire is like when you keep going for something but you don't get it. And we recognize this lots of times when it's like, oh, I really want this, and then you get it, like, no, that wasn't it, right? It usually works that way romantically, right? I really want that person, and then no, that's sort of not, that's sort of real disappointment. So this kind of, that's not a personal thing. No, sometimes. So anyway, so desire is this kind of open thing that you don't get it. Drive is where you can't help but get it. And I always think, and I didn't grow up Catholic, but I always think of flagellating priests, right? Going like, right? They're supposed to like get rid of their desire for earthly things, but they're quickly getting off as they're like eating themselves. Or another thing, or slot machines, right? Nobody goes for a slot machine as a kind of rational way to meet a goal. Rather, it's like, oh, I'm going to do this will be fun. I'll just do it another 5 times. If I do it 3 more, it'll be, and so that's that little bitty extra. Or the other version would be, if someone sends you a really great kiddie video on YouTube, and you watch it, and then you might look at 3 other ones, and they're never as good, right? The first one, but the looking, right, you get attached to these looking at these other ones. So that's the, so that attachment that is sort of kind of pathetic, and you circle around doing it, that's drive, and the like is desire. Now, what happens I think in a lot of left politics is we get really preoccupied with the little things that we constantly screw up. And we get, like, everyone's trying to get prepared for something, and then you have another side fight about something, and then that has to get resolved, and then you're really all invested in the side fight, and then you have to do the other thing, and then that doesn't work out, but you get overly invested in that, and then you keep exhausting yourself through these tiny little things. And you might say, oh, well, 3 people were arrested. Great, which is a strange thing to cheer about, right? But you feel like, oh, that was something. And it gets you off on the cycle of repetition and failure. I think that this drive describes a kind of, particularly at left democratic politics, where we get preoccupied with these little things, we get off on small, teeny victories, we get even more off on small little failures. So I think it's a circular drive, right? Not one where it's like, what's our goal? Well, I think our goal is bringing down capitalism. Our goal is restoring it, or not restoring. Our goal is like is putting something that matters for actual people, for working people. Our goal is some kind of collective determination of the commons. But you don't really talk about that. You talk about how can we get 25 people to show up for this event. And yay, that one was really successful, but we're all too tired to do another one. So I think that we have gotten sidetracked in drive. It makes sense, and we do it really a lot in media things. And we've lost sight of desire. And I actually now, so that's what I think it works on the activist side. And I think on the kind of theory, on the theoretical part, Zizek, like you said, the Slovenian school does see more of a hope on drive, but there are a few opportunities in his writing where he gestures to Lacan's account of the desire of the analyst. As something else, as what's beyond the drive. And usually what happens is Zizek's text sort of collapse at that point, right? I mean, he might, and you draw these out, like how he turns to a joke or a failure at these points of collapse in his text, or just sort of changes into a new section, and you have no idea why. And so in these, it's like, but every once in a while there might be a gesture to something like the desire of the analyst, which is, right, a formal position of transference that holds open non-knowledge that you're supposed to work in relation to. And so, and in the Fragile Absolute, Zizek has a very strange thing about revolutionary collectives of marching analysts, which doesn't seem that inspiring, but it could be a kind of great model if you think about a collective of folks who actually don't really know, but still have a solidarity with one another. So that's how I try to put these two sides together.
I mean, there's a point where it comes very close, because I think we both have talked about in different occasions maybe, but on the melancholy part. But I think there's something else going on too, which is, and maybe it doesn't exactly fall in that pattern, which is something that I was trying to point out in that passage about speculative leftism, which is, it's hard to describe somebody like Badiou, or even take another with seemingly very disparate or even polar opposite position, Negri's position. Both Badiou and Negri are hard to sort of qualify as attached to failure. They're almost like giddy with, and with the, they overflow with exuberant enthusiasm for the fact that almost everything is possible. And even though Badiou has some of his melancholy moments, and both of them actually have been read as melancholics, or maybe there's some alternative phase after the manic phase. But still, in the case of Badiou, I think there's something else going on, and so I wonder what they do share at the same time is a complete rejection of party-state frameworks, right? Or complete rejection of anything resembling a connection between socialism and communism. Right? What you sort of call the merger narrative, right? That comes from out of Lenin, so that there is a certain movement or history that merges with political organizations of the workers, and that would lead from socialism to communism. So the consensus now is that that narrative is no longer possible, and it's maybe not melancholy, but there's something there in the enthusiasm with which that thesis is being stated that also hides something, or is, for me, sort of unable to really come to terms with the fact that it is going to be limited to what you call sort of, not identity politics, but in any case, the narrowly defined, negatively defined politics of pure militancy that refuses to embrace anything resembling a party or a state. Right? And this is what I call speculative leftism, as a moment where politics can still proclaim a need for militancy, but precisely because there is such a strong rejection, particularly of the state apparatus, because what's at stake with the party, of course, is that for Badiou, but also for Negri, what's wrong with the party is that both in the East and in the West, the party has been too closely associated with the state, either through a parliamentary system, representational systems, or through the one-party state. And I think that's a diagnostic that applies to a specific context, but is then generalized, as we can no longer think in terms of party and state. And so the reason why I turn to Garcia Linera at the end as an alternative or a way out of sort of Western European either melancholy, what you call attachment to a loss and to failure, but also the newfound enthusiasm for a party-less form of militancy is precisely to somehow put back on the table also the question of the state. The form of the state, with a very simple statement, which is that Garcia Linera said, look, if the state is a vampire, sort of an excessive form of power that always feeds off the people, then it means that the source of power of the state is obviously with the people. And therefore there's no, what about taking that back? And in Latin America, that's less and less a problematic statement to make. Even mainstream journalists say that all the time, that there's the need for constitutional reform, complete overthrow of the organization of the state. And so this is where I think I was interested in seeing how many of these diagnostics are limited to being a diagnostic of the failure of Western European communism and Eurocommunism. And their own Maoist, Trotskyist, or autonomist search for an alternative form of political organization, which miserably failed. And so it's almost as though it's a statement about Mitterrand socialism or about Eurocommunism in Italy, which is then general. And this is why I go back to this question about what more can be done in terms of the actuality of communism.
Yeah, I found that the chapter on Garcia Linera very interesting and kind of a curveball. It was completely new to me, so I really recommend it. You kind of end with this figure of Garcia Linera as a kind of model of this way of engaging with the state in a non-statist mode. Jody does something I think that's a bit more radical, where she actually says the people desire communism. That's what they desire. And she says we don't have to continue to live in the wake of left failure, stuck in the repetitions of crises and spectacle. The premise of communism is that collective determination of collective conditions is possible if we want it. And so this question of who is the wanting agent, I think who is the historical agent, I mean, the left is always obsessed with that. Who is it, the proletariat, the radical worker? And you both have interesting things to say on this subject. Bruno on the way that we've sort of retreated into this victim mode, and you on your idea of the people as the rest of us. So maybe if you could speak on this idea of this subject, and then we could go more into, I think there's more to be said about desire. And then I'm going to leave it to the audience to interrogate you guys on what the hell a party relation is, and whether we can picture it. But yeah, the subject. Who is desiring communism? Where are they? Is it us?
I don't think I said the people desire communism yet. But we need to think about communism in terms of collective desire and how that might be possible. And one of the things that I think is that yes, the people are the subject of communism, but we've got to understand subject in kind of not our everyday way, right? And we know this sort of when we all are, have our theory hats on. We recognize that subjects are split and fragmented and non-fully self-conscious and that we have there's always an unconscious or things that we are affected by that have to do with our physical surroundings and our materiality. Right? So the last 40 or 50 years of critical theory around the subject, I think we have to think about as we think about the subject of politics and collectively. So when I am trying to think about the people as the rest of us, what I want to do is use that as a way to posit the people as a split subject, right? So the people who are not sort of fully ever present, but are nonetheless, nonetheless still exert a pressure. And so I shift around on that in the book, in some way, moving from in some ways a subject to also a name, to also the object cause of communist desire. So that really, if there is something like a communist desire, it could only be a desire that is for, basically for the common good of the people, right? For the people's collective determination of their collective lives. So what I hope to invoke is more a kind of openness and possibility, rather than a kind of firm subject. And and the thing is like I think that that's also what we kind of think that we actually kind of already accept and think, right? Nobody really thinks that something like an election means, like we don't think that every single person votes, right? We know that would be crazy, but we can still say things like, well, the American people did blah, blah, blah. So we can say things like, a collective subject does this without being limited by a kind of empirical, well, where are they? Well, it's presence in buildings and affects and flows of things, and we still feel that force.
I really got Jody's concept today when I was reading a new piece in the London Review of Books about Occupy Wall Street, and the argument is basically the 99% is a false promise because 99% of the population weren't in the 99%.
Yeah.
And I felt like your concept became clear to me as I read this very empirical dismissal of the concept of the 99%, which Jody riffs on.
But what's so important about it, right, is it still exerts a force in the name of the 99% or in the name of a collective people that we feel, right? So it exceeds the empirical referent. And all of us, the last year have felt that, no matter what the kind of empirical numbers are. And that's what I think has to be, as we think about a collective people as a communist subject, we have to think about it that direction.
But also, the 99%, immediately sort of people started saying, well, I heard people say, well, maybe I'm somewhere, this was before the Romney comment, maybe I'm like more in the 49th percent, in terms of like what, tax brackets? So it's not sort of like locate yourself on the scale of the percentage of the population, but the fact that it had this effect that even people who rejected it and mocked it recognized that there was a force that exceeded the empirical reference of 99% of the population. The same in the Tahrir Square, even like mainstream media started saying, the Egyptian people. And well, let's say there were 150,000 people. That's not, percentage-wise, doesn't represent the Egyptian people. So there was suddenly a logic of political representation that was not based on empirical numbers or representatives, but that had sort of a dynamic force that exceeded, but this is not really 99%, it's 200 people. Yeah, but 200 people managed to appeal and create an identificatory effect that a large mass of people said, yes, we actually feel part of the we. And this is something else that I want to draw attention to. It's not just about the subject of desire, but I think Jodi's very eloquent when she talks about, it's about collective subjects.
Yeah, really clear.
And here I'd like to maybe ask you a little bit to start being to open up questions and maybe criticisms, right? You are also critical of some aspects of Occupy Wall Street in terms of what it does or did in terms of individualizing of some of the sort of the question about representation and self-representation. So if you could say a little bit more about, for example, the organization of general assemblies and the so-called the horizontalism and what that did in terms of collective versus individual. Because you're very critical of some of those tendencies. if you want to go there.
Yeah, I kind of want to be sort of happy, fluffy bunnies, but I'll still, I'll bring the, I'll say what he has in mind. But I'm going to use an example because you were there, Jason was there. This was at sometime last October in Washington Square Park, and there was a couple of thousand. It was at night, a couple of thousand people debating whether or not they were going to take the park that night.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so other folks were there. So I'm sure the person who about the trash is probably, I hope not. But it was, you know, people had brought sleeping bags and tents. I mean, yes, there were police around the park. They were sort of kind of slowly letting you know that they were definitely going to close things down. But there was a debate about whether or not to, you know, try to stay in the park that night. And there was a lot of what seemed to me to be, you know, enthusiasm for trying to stay in the park. And people were speaking very eloquently. And then someone said something like, and of course it's each person's own autonomous decision. And then everyone, of course, you know, it's each person's autonomous decision. And at that point, once the kind of collective energy got fragmented, and the different people's own you know, individual concerns, which are real, right? I'm not saying that those were not real concerns that folks had. Those took over from what had been the much more collective general feeling of a common strength. And so it's that kind of individualism that started to concern me more and more in the movement, right? And I think that, you know, autonomy actually, as I understand it, has meant, at least in Italy, autonomy from the Communist Party, right? It meant autonomous communists who weren't going to be co-opted by a basically kind of corrupt Italian communist state party. But in the US version, it seems like autonomy just means, you know, a libertarianism, right? What any one person wants to do. And that's a mistake. That's a bad translation mistake, and we have let it you know, influence our politics in a disruptive and not cool way. So I think, so that's one of the things that I'm pretty critical of, that kind of individualism, and how it also coordinates with, or articulates with horizontality as a total kind of paranoia for the real existing leaders, right? They're real leaders. They're real groups who make decisions. The General Assemblies are not where all of the important decisions are made. It's really important to be able to say that and talk about that, or it was important when those were more actually functioning. But not being able to talk about that became kind of damaging. And I actually think if the movement's self-understanding had been more in terms of what makes it strong, its divisive relationship to capitalism, and the fact that it says there's an enemy, the 1%. And so its collective strength, its representation of itself in terms of the gap in, or the hole in Wall Street, and its emphasis on collectivity, that's where the movement's strength was. And that's where the movement's strength, I think, can be, and you know, is maybe because of, you know, exciting initiatives like Strike Debt.
Did anybody see that video of the Walmart workers mic checking recently? I thought that was such a powerful. I was so sick of the mic check as a form, and then to see it used in this way. We will not meet with you individually. We are here collectively to bargain. Was a really beautiful thing. That said, you know, you read at one point, democracy is the form loss of communism takes, and I wonder about creating this divide between democracy and communism. And you said, well, we have democracy. That's sort of the ambient milieu we're in. And I, you know, yeah, I disagree. I'm wondering why so harsh on democracy? Shouldn't we try it?
I actually think we live in a democracy, and this is what democracy looks like.
Unlike.
Yeah, seriously, right? I mean, people can you know, speak their minds, voice themselves, share opinions, circulate petitions. People can vote and do all these sorts of things, and it just gets completely, you know, trapped in this support system for capitalism. I mean, Lenin is actually wonderful on this. Democracy is a great system for the power of the bourgeoisie. I mean, we've got to remember our Lenin here. So no, I don't think that we need to limit how we understand our politics by a term like democracy, and that's what we've been told for at least the last 150 years. Right? We've been said that's the limit of your politics. No, and this is why I love the Communist Horizon. Right? No, that's not the limit. This is where our options are.
And I also think that, to some extent, there's a certain use of theory that has been complicit in this, which sort of the cheapened version of the critique of representation, which you hear regurgitated very often in more or less sophisticated terms, sort of this notion that one should not speak for anybody else. Mm-hmm. And it seems then that it's unproblematic to speak for yourself. Right? Well, in a sense, that's already a basic contradiction with the slightest version of this critique of representation, which of course starts with the fact that the unit of the individual completely breaks down, whether you're a Nietzschean or a Spinozist, and that it's ludicrous to sort of hold on to the illusion of self-representation, or even, it's not much different from one person, one vote. And so everybody can self-represent, but nobody can speak for anybody else. But as soon as you need to get something done, I was at Occupy Boston, and there was like a harsh, Marxist-Leninist, and he said, I love it. I tell people what to do, and the anarchists are always there to do it. And he said, the one thing you have to tell them, they're never coming to the meetings, but if you need something done, you can call the anarchists. They're not going to come to the meeting, but they need somebody to sort of make some of the decisions. And so that was a perfect working relationship.
The individual is already a split subject, and you are putting your hope in this idea. The collective subject will somehow speak in a more coherent, for our individual desire is already split and fragmented and unknowable to us, then what hope is there for this collective desire channeled through the party to speak in a more coherent fashion or religious?
I don't think it's about, actually I don't think it's about speaking or coherence. I actually think it's about acting and force, right? It's a powerful collective of people pushing and moving. And I think sort of struggling together. That's the way I see it. I don't think the goal is, can we sort of think straightforwardly, blah, 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 though that can be helpful. I actually think that this kind of sort of party or idea that I have is one where folks will always be struggling and dividing and arguing with one another, but moving forward in solidarity, arguing about the same things, arguing about what is the best way for the collective people to determine their common lives, not to have them determined by property, finance, banks, capitalism.
The party as container for arguments?
Yeah.
Let's open it up to the audience. I wouldn't mind, would Winter like to ask his question that we discussed? Okay, then I'll kind of ask Winter's question because I thought it was interesting. Which was, to go back to this idea of desire. I'm not going to say. You said that the analyst holds this final position of transference and holds open this space of non-knowledge. And you say at one point in the book, though, that the party is like the analyst, but only is telling people what to desire, which is communism.
No, it's not telling people what to desire. Communism is the object cause, what gets desired, what holds it in place, what gets it in motion, right? It's like in a sort of Lacanian world, what you desire is never the ice cream or the book or the something. It's this other extra excessive part of it that's kind of intangible, that's just your own attachment to it. So it's not like the party is telling folks what to desire, right? It's the vehicle for helping them realize it, know it, right? Even if they don't know it themselves, right? Because they don't know it themselves. If they know it themselves, they wouldn't need a party.
In the simplest sense, how does that distinguish itself from the first reference I think of just in terms of ordinary narratives in American society? I think of something nearly like the floating signifier of an afterlife in religion, right? People, if you go to the framework, people are living by these principles because there's this notion that there is this end that drives all of their, I'm probably butchering all types of Lacanian notions here, but I'm just thinking. So if there's this end, there would be, as you're saying, with the idea that the end, the driving what's driving people is this notion of communism that's implicitly desired. How would that be different from the idea of today people having this desire pursuing heaven and then these structures popping up, you're pursuing some kind of like utopian bliss when we see that play out in other instances, and then institutions come along that don't fulfill that, or obviously.
Right. The thing that I'm trying to describe or capture or express here is that the desire is not the same thing as reaching the end. The desire is your orientation to others and what you're struggling for and why you're struggling at all, right? It's part of the way a collective desires its own collectivity or its own collective determination of its lives and futures. So the way I actually express it, and it's kind of formal and abstract, is to try to think of communist desire as a collective desire for collectivity. And so the idea would be that if we really think that people need to collectively determine their lives, right, so that we collectively make decisions about production and distribution, then we don't think that we ever reach that, right? I mean, that's not done. That's an ongoing thing that we would always have to be doing and be making ourselves into those people who can continue to do that. So it's not like we get to an end result where it's all finished, right? The world keeps changing. We keep changing. And, the weather changes, the climate's a mess. The plagues happen. So always there are things that are going on and changing. So it's not just like, we reach communism and everybody goes to sleep, right? This is actually, I was actually going to ask Bruno about this, because I think we actually have somewhat of the one thing we might disagree on is, or be different about. I like the way he thinks about the actuality of communism in the struggle, though I'm not sure how much of I'm not sure exactly how you think about the actuality in our present life. Is it present as the actuality of our thinking about it, of our collective practices? Martin Doller says that whenever 2 or 3 smokers are gathered, that's the actuality of communism. And so, but anyway, so the difference is it's not the kind of heaven or goal, it's the collective working together to solve your collective ways of being. Does that make sense?
It seems to me that there is an interesting contradiction between the way you talk about desire as lack and this very productive way you're describing desire, and describing desire as productive point us toward a totally different genealogy of desire, right? So how do you reconcile these two genealogies, desire as lack and desire as productivity? Because it seems to me that in what you're saying, desire is extremely productive, is producing the new, right? So how do you?
Yeah, I think that the reason that that there is the production is because of the lack underlying it, right? That you wouldn't have all of this kind of that if you had a kind of incessant movement for its own sake, that's drive. Right? And then that's where you get kind of trapped in the means and making the little making things that are just basically that's how you get trapped in failure and getting off on failure and being more preoccupied with the means than preoccupied with the goal or the end. And so the goal or the end is lacking, right? You don't know what that's going to be, but you work towards it. So it's almost a matter of vision, and where are you looking? Are you looking outward, or are you kind of like navel gazing? Right. So, but I would hope that kind of sort of Spinoza's inclined comrades would sort of say, okay, well, we don't have to be enemies anymore.
I think my question is very similar to that. And when you say, we live in democracy, and this is what democracy looks like, but then you also say, the communist horizon is always already here. So, so it's present at all times. So I'm wondering about the shift that must take place in terms of desire. It's like, how does desire change? Because the communist horizon is always here, and this is what the communist horizon looks like.
That's neat. But when we don't always see it, right? We don't always focus on it. We get focused on little trivial things. We get sucked into all sorts of democratic practices like this inane election, where that is what we're doing, that's what the politics is, that's what matters. So we lose sight of the communist horizon. We don't see it. We're told all the time, right, that, oh, communism is past, it's discredited, it's hideous, it's corrupt, nobody wants that, that's awful. But I mean, I argue that the reason we're told this all the time is because it's a present force. Right? They wouldn't have, nobody's like, oh my God, that Ottoman Empire, we have to really trash it all. So I think the difference is where, you know, do we see it, and are we looking at it, or are we focused on these other things?
How is this what the actuality of communism looks like?
No, but I think it's a very interesting question. To sort of, well, if they're always, both of them already are here, like how do you move from one to the other, and what's the actual presence then of that other? And I'm less inclined to sort of talk about working from within a lack, right? And then you get the question, well, but you're, you know, Jodi's the last person to speak from lack in a sense, you know. So I'm not so sure about that, because I think that's another one of these terms that I think has been used or has been put to service as part of this sort of diagnostic of finding a silver lining in the cloud of failure. Well, but you know, we shouldn't have a full subject. Thank God we don't have a full communist subject. You know, we can still work from lacks and little gaps, and we should subjectivize our gaps. And you know, that's way better than having a full subject. You know, boo, you know, bad and angry because he has a full subject. And I'm not so sure about that, but it still leaves open the question of sort of how do you move from what's here to what's also here, but obviously not in the same sense. And I want to go back to that. It's related to the question about religion, because I think you get this so often, like how is it different from religion? And I think because of, you know, centuries of civilization, we are now used to thinking about the operations of ideology in terms of religion. And as soon as we try to sort of come to terms with how these questions of subjective desire and collectivity really works, I know what Jodi's working on now, sort of crowd desires, people say, oh, but that's religion. That's just, you know, and we use the critique of ideology, the critique of religion that we know from our Marxist classes, and we sort of apply that to, oh, let's be careful that communism doesn't become kind of a new heaven. And, well, it's certainly not transcendent, it's certainly not hereafter, but it is interesting, of course, that people have no problem celebrating the operations of ideology when it's called religion, and as soon as it's something else, and it starts from a completely different premise, without transcendence, without God, without the individual sort of relation to, you know, some superior figure, people are at a loss to talk about what happens there. And their tendency is, oh, I can explain it if it is like religion. Whether it's in favor or against, like Zizek would say, that's great, you know. Sure, it's like religion, you know, all the more so. And others would say that it's bad because it's a repetition of a Christian mold of subjectivization. But I think it's a symptomatic question that people are sort of grappling with what's really going on, questions of subjectivization, identification, the working of ideology in all of its senses. And the only way people talk about, oh, it's a religious effect.
And this gentleman over here.
No, thanks for letting me speak. So Jodi knows I read her book in the last 48 hours. It's the best book I read in the last 3 years. But
He's a good friend.
yeah, no, it really is. But I want to challenge you on a couple points. I mean, my first reaction was that it's really the capitalist horizon. In the sense that, in other words, the lack that we find is because of the world that we actually exist in is a thoroughly capitalist, neoliberalized world, increasingly so, in a way that we have absolutely almost no control over, which intensifies our desire for something else, something beyond the individual. So I don't think it's a dialectical voluntarism that you talked about, which I thought was brilliant, but it's a dialectic between what it is that we want to do now versus what it is as individuals versus what it is that we can do collectively in the future. That's the capitalist horizon, which may have a collectivity in mind. And And though, you know, so, you know, I think Zizek at one point did go back to the 18th Brumaire and say, well, the first time it's a tragedy, the second time it's a farce. And I think it is a real, it's dangerous to say that it's a communist horizon, when in fact, that is just trying to recreate the problems that we had in the past. And whether that's associated with religion or not, you know, and I think there are many different religions, so some are better than others. The older I get, I'm attached to some as opposed to others. And so I don't think we want to put scare quotes around that, but I think we want to understand who we are now and how it is that we can act collectively in spite of what capitalism does to us. And that might involve allowing Occupy to be Occupy and voting for Obama. And walking and chewing gum at the same time is not that difficult. And that is what's going to enable us to move beyond this, not trying to recreate the past. That would be my check.
I just want to add on to that, because I have a sort of vaguely connected thought, which was a little tweet meme that went around today that said democracy brought to you by its sponsors. And I guess I'm wondering a little bit about the lack in the same sense. Is it being sponsored by capitalism? I guess a shortened version of maybe something very similar.
I think that the question about the lack in that direction is really interesting, and I don't have a good answer right now. Bruno mentioned that I'm starting to think about, I'm doing research on crowds, and as a way to keep pushing the collective desire part. And I've been interested in the way that Freud, the Freudian unconscious is a crowd, right? I mean, literally, right? It comes from Levin. It's like an enclosure, right? Like in the old primitive accumulation, right? So it's an enclosure of the crowd inside, and that seems like a way that individualism involves a production of a lack of connection, fluidity that blends you together with other folks. So in that sense, I think that there are interesting ways to talk about the lack in the capitalist direction. I mean, for psychoanalysis, I mean, there are always constitutive lacks, right? And so it's not that there would be any kind of one kind in particular. You can use it to think through different kinds of structures. So that's why I would say, yes, it can be useful to think that way, but I wouldn't say in some stronger sense that there is. Now, on the same, I don't think that we need to structure our politics around a fear of some bad experiments, right? I mean, we've got, you know, I think that says that we are incapable of not being determined by one history, that we're incapable of imagining collectively something new, and that we're incapable of together building something else. And I just don't think that's true. That maybe that's naive, maybe that's a leap of faith, but to not think this means that you accept an unbelievable kind of determinism. And I just don't find that plausible. So I don't think that we are trapped by the experiments gone wrong of the 20th century. I think we can try again. And that we can try again learning from them, right? Why say, oh, it will only go that way? Why don't we say, God, there were some horrible things that happened. How do we learn from those and change it? How do we learn from those and avoid those mistakes? How do we learn from those and go someplace else? Like, I don't want to have a politics based on thinking about who we are now. That, to me, is the kind of navel, I mean, this is harsh and polemical, the kind of navel gazing that I think I think we've got to get out of this identity, even if it's collective identity, and think about something that we project ourselves towards, that we build together towards in the future, but not turn inward.
I want Bruno to answer that as well, because so much of his book touches on the way that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still thinking about Malcolm Dollar's comment that three smokers getting together or smoking outside a building are a communist experiment, and I think that it speaks to the fact that I was interested in the possibility that that might well be the case, and that it's a question of sort of finding a middle ground between saying, oh, things are great, communist horizon is here, and it's here to stay, and on the other hand saying, no, we live within a capitalist horizon, and anything we think of is beyond the horizon. And there's sort of versions of both of those approaches, right? The Italians somehow saying, well, you know, if you flip the coin, we can see that there's already a kind of a cooperative potential present here, and therefore it's not really a question about organizing a communist beyond the horizon, because we need to look at what our current system already lives of, which is, in a sense, communist desire. And there's the opposite, more melancholy approach, which says that our horizon is completely closed, and there's no possibility whatsoever of any innovative experiments because everything is already co-opted before you start. And so the desire of talking in terms of the actuality, like the real movement, you know, the Marxian expression, communism is not sort of a utopian beyond to which we have to adjust ourselves or to which thought has to adjust it. But he talks about a real movement, both in the sense of, yes, of course, a real movement is the logic of capital, but there's also things that are happening within that resist it. And that can move from, depends on where they're smoking. You know, if they're smoking outside their building because they're asked to be at least 20 feet away from the building, and they're not organizing against that, you know, I don't think there's anything communist about it. But, you know, if it's a small moment of self-government, why not? You know, I think if there's sort of a gathering awareness, but also a practice, what about this sort of called a thought practice, which doesn't separate clearly between theory and practice. If there's sort of a gathering of moments of self-governance thought practices that are not entirely inscribed within the capitalist horizon, why not call that, you know, sort of a fragmented actuality of communism?